Good morning. Welcome to the public meeting for the SDEIS Reservoir Revised Draft Environmental Impact Report, Supplemental Draft Environmental Impact Statement. My name is Sarah Katz, and I will serve as the meeting moderator today. A revised draft environmental impact report, supplemental draft environmental impact statement, is often referred to by its acronym, RDEIR, SDEIS. So you may hear us using these terms today, or perhaps revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS throughout today's meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to provide an overview of the project and the draft environmental analysis, as well as to answer questions and accept official public comments on the revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS. I will provide an overview of the meeting agenda briefly now, before I introduce the SDEIS Project Authority and Bureau of Reclamation representatives. First up will be the project presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will review how to participate in this meeting. We will have a question and answer session followed by formal public comment. The public meeting will then conclude. A few housekeeping items first. For your awareness, the meeting is being recorded so we can post the meeting presentation on our SDEIS project website for those who were unable to join. Closed captioning is also available during this meeting. If it doesn't automatically appear, you can click the CC icon, which is likely at the bottom of your screen. As we are in an online environment, we may experience glitches or temporary issues. Please bear with us as we work through any unforeseen technical issues as swiftly as possible. And finally, we ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of the project presentation. Once the presentation concludes, we will begin the question and answer session. I'd now like to introduce our SDEIS Environmental Planning and Permitting Manager, Ali Forsythe, who will begin delivering the project presentation. We also have a representative from the Bureau of Reclamation, Vanessa King. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Ali Forsythe. I lead the environmental planning and permitting efforts for the SDEIS Authority. I'll lead us through about a 30-minute presentation before we get into the question and answer session. We will start out with an overview of the SDEIS Reservoir project. I'll then provide an overview of the California Environmental Quality Act and the National Environmental Policy Act requirements. And I'll finish out the presentation with an overview of the revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS, including an overview of the findings in the document and how to provide comments. As Sarah mentioned, we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so you can provide your questions in the question and answer box. We will answer these at the end of the presentation. I suspect most of you on this call know this, but I wanted to make sure that we have a high-level overview of what SDEIS Reservoir is. SDEIS is a proposed off-stream reservoir west of the community of Maxwell, California, in the Sacramento Valley. Being off-stream, the reservoir would impound two local intermittent creeks, but would not dam a major river or block salmon migration. SDEIS would be filled with water diverted from the Sacramento River at the existing Red Bluff pumping plant and Hamilton City pump stations during high flow conditions. You can see the locations of these two facilities at the top of the map on your screen. This water would be conveyed to the new SDEIS Reservoir using the existing Tehama-Colusa Canal and GCID Main Canal. Water would be stored in the new reservoir for later use by farms, cities, and the environment. SDEIS is being funded by a diverse group, the state through Proposition 1, the federal government, along with public water agencies located throughout the state. These funding organizations and the people of the state of California would receive the water supply benefits that result from the project, which includes environmental, recreation, and flood control benefits also. From the back-to-back record-breaking dry years of 2014 and 15 to the nearly record-breaking wet year of 2017, we can all see the huge variability in our climate in California. And the science indicates that this variability is going to continue into the future. SITES is one tool in what should be a vast toolbox of measures and actions to help restore flexibility, reliability, and resiliency to our state in the face of climate change. SITES Reservoir would be built, owned, and operated by the SITES Project Authority. And SITES Reservoir isn't new. It's been discussed for many years, originally as a state or federally owned reservoir, and now led by the SITES Project Authority. Back in 2017, the Authority and Reclamation released a draft EIR, EIS for the project. The project envisioned in the 2017 document was larger, had a greater diversion capacity, including another intake on the Sacramento River at Delavan, along with a large hydroelectric pumpback generation facility. This was essentially the project formulated by the state and federal governments in the previous decade. Starting in 2019 and continuing into 2020, the authority made a number of refinements to the project. These were completed to reduce the cost of the project, but also to reduce the environmental effects. And we heard you. A number of these refinements were also made in response to the comments received on the 2017 document, along with discussions with tribal governments, non-governmental organizations, and state and federal regulatory agencies. In this timeframe, the authority considered 16 new and modified configurations to the project. These modifications included changes in facility footprints, such as making the reservoir smaller, changes in operational criteria, which we'll discuss on a later slide, changes in conveyance and removal of the Delavan pipeline, which reduced the overall project's ability to divert water off the Sacramento River from about 6,000 cubic feet per second to 3,900 cubic feet per second, or really by about a third. Along with the reliance on existing local infrastructure and the addition of the Dunnigan pipeline and use of the Colusa Basin drain for releases from the reservoir. The pump generation facility was also removed from the project. The changes to the project in the 2019-2020 timeframe resulted in new or different project footprints and new or different project operations, really new alternatives to the project. As these alternatives were not previously analyzed in the 2017 document, the Authority and Reclamation decided to revise, supplement, and recirculate the previously released EIR EIS. Preparation of this revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS, allows the Authority and Reclamation the ability to address the changes made in the project, along with updating things in the 2017 document that have also changed, such as the modeling baseline, the existing condition, and some of our cumulative projects. In making these updates, the Authority and Reclamation also took into consideration the comments received on the 2017 document. There are 3 action alternatives considered in the revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS. This table provides a summary of them, and we'll walk through the footprint components for each in the next few slides. The alternatives vary based on a few key factors. From the local community perspective, there are different reservoir sizes, with alternative 1 and 3 having a 1.5 million acre foot reservoir. This would result in about 13,000 acre or 20 square mile reservoir footprint. And alternative 2 would be slightly smaller at 1.3 million acre feet with about a 12,000 acre or 19 square mile footprint. In addition, and from the local community perspective, the alternatives vary based on the route to the west side of the reservoir, with alternative 1 and 3 having a bridge across the reservoir, and alternative 2 with a road around the southern end. Alternatives also vary based on where water is released from the reservoir back into the Sacramento River. Alternatives 1 and 3 release water through the Dunnigan pipeline to the Colusa Basin drain, which flows back into the Sacramento River at Knight's Landing. And alternative 2 extends that Dunnigan pipeline all the way out to the Sacramento River and releases water back directly into the river. All alternatives include possible operational exchanges with reclamation, really to benefit the Coldwater Pool in Shasta and Salmonids in the upper Sacramento River system. But the alternatives vary based on how much reclamation would invest in the project. Alternative 1 includes a range of no investment up to 7%. Alternative 2 includes no investment by reclamation. And alternative 3 includes up to 25% investment by reclamation in the project. The document also includes a no action alternative, or what would happen if the project were not built. This slide is a map from both the executive summary and project description chapters and shows the project facilities and the area of the footprint for alternative 1 and 3. Water would be diverted for the project at the existing Red Bluff pumping plant and Hamilton City pump station during high flow conditions. This water would be conveyed to the new site's reservoir using the existing Tehama-Coosa Canal and GCID main canal. Most of these facilities are off your map, but you can see the 2 existing canals in yellow running north to south on this map. Water would be pumped up into the new reservoir, which would be 1.5 million acre feet from either the existing Funks Reservoir or the new Terminal Regulating Reservoir East. This would require 2 new pump generating plants, associated pipelines, and power facilities. In these 2 alternatives, you can see the bridge across the reservoir to continue to connect the communities of Maxwell and Ladoga to the west, shown here in pink. There are 2 main dams on Funks and Stone Corral Creeks, and a number of saddle dams and dikes in the northern end of the reservoir. There would also be a number of road improvements and realignments, both for construction access and also to ensure local landowners in the area can continue to access their properties. All of the alternatives include 3 new recreation areas, 2 shown in green on this map adjacent to the reservoir footprint, and a boat ramp, a day use facility on the west end of the reservoir. This map shows the release facilities for alternatives 1 and 3. Water would come down the Tehama-Coosa Canal, seen there in yellow on the left-hand side of the map, and would be released into the Dunnigan Pipeline, shown in pink. The Dunnigan Pipeline would cross Interstate 5 and the Ritchie Brothers auction yard, and then terminate over at the Coosa Basin Drain. Alternative 2 includes many of the same facilities as alternatives 1 and 3. However, the location of the terminal regulating reservoir is a little different in alternative 2. It's located to the west of the GCID main canal. Also notable is the extension of Huffmaster Road in the into the South Road to provide access from Maxwell over to Ladoga. There would be no bridge in alternative 2. The main dams would be a little smaller in this alternative as the reservoir is a little smaller, and there would be fewer saddle dams and dikes in the northern end of the reservoir. This map shows the release facilities for alternative 2. Similar to the other alternatives, water would come down the Tehama-Coosa Canal, seen there in yellow, and be released into the Dunnigan Pipeline, also shown in yellow on this map. But in this alternative, the Dunnigan Pipeline would extend all the way over to the Sacramento River. There would be the ability to release some water into the Coosa Basin Drain for environmental purposes, but most of the releases would be direct to the Sacramento River. As I mentioned on the maps, all of the alternatives include 3 new recreation areas. These would include campsites, picnic sites, hiking trails, and boat launch facilities. The authority intends to phase the approach to building these recreation areas to match the interest. And all of the alternatives would provide flood control benefits to Maxwell and the adjacent agricultural areas, including reducing flooding of Interstate 5 and a 100-year flood event. This, of course, is important to the local community and the local economy, but also important regionally and statewide to reduce flooding of Interstate 5, a major thoroughfare for our state. There is a tremendous effort underway to evaluate and develop the project. We are currently targeting the end of next year to complete the environmental review process. Our permitting and water right efforts are underway, and we expect to complete our key permits in mid-2023. There is also quite an engineering design effort for a project of this magnitude, with involvement and approval by the Division of Safety of Dams. We expect to complete all engineering design efforts in late 2025. Construction would start at mid-2024 and would be sequenced over time. We'd likely build roads and the bridge if that is selected first, both to get construction equipment to the site, but also because we need to keep a route from Maxwell over to Ladoga open during construction. Things like main dams, saddle dams, and dikes, would likely follow once the roads are in place to access construction locations. And things like the terminal regulating reservoir and pipelines, including the Dunnigan pipeline, would follow later in the construction period. So some folks may be wondering why we're preparing this revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS. We are doing this to comply with the California Environmental Quality Act, generally abbreviated as CEQA, and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. CEQA is state law and applies to all discretionary approvals by state agencies. Thus, the authority has to comply with CEQA prior to moving forward with the project. And NEPA is a federal law and applies to all major federal undertakings. Thus, reclamation has to comply with NEPA prior to deciding to invest in the project or to issue approvals for the project. Both CEQA and NEPA require that the agencies analyze the environmental effects of actions that they are planning to undertake to inform decision makers and the public of the effects of these actions. They both foster informed, transparent decision-making and encourage public participation in the decision-making process. An EIR is required under CEQA and an EIS is required under NEPA when there would be one or more significant or adverse impacts on the environment. The EIR/EIS discloses the environmental effects of a project, identifies possible ways to minimize those effects, and describes reasonable alternatives to the project. The authority is the lead agency for the EIR under CEQA, as the authority would decide whether to build and operate the project. And reclamation is the lead agency for the EIS under NEPA, as reclamation would decide whether to provide funding for the project and will decide whether to issue project agreements, such as a land lease and a water wheeling agreement called a Warrant Act contract under reclamation law. The EIR/EIS process began back in 2001 when Reclamation and the California Department of Water Resources issued a notice of intent and notice of preparation respectively for the project. The authority issued a second notice of preparation in 2017 when we took over the lead agency role from DWR. We are now at that green line you see on this slide, the public and agency review of the revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS. Your comments are very important to us and very important to the process. They help us continue to refine the project to reduce environmental effects. After the public review timeframe ends, the authority and reclamation will prepare the final EIR/EIS, which will include revisions to the project based on comments received. The final document will also include responses to the comments received. After the final EIR/EIS is released, the authority and reclamation separately will decide whether to carry out the respective portions of the project and complete the associated agency decision documents and noticing. The revised draft EIR supplemental draft EIS is quite an extensive document. Chapters 1 through 4 include the introductory materials, the project description, and an overview of the analysis. They're really the foundational chapters that set up the rest of the document. The document includes an analysis of environmental resources in 26 chapters and 73 corresponding appendices. And the last few chapters include analyses like cumulative growth inducement and other required sections. When preparing an EIR or EIS, the lead agency must consider both the direct and indirect effects of a project. Impacts are determined by comparing to baseline physical conditions, what we call the baseline or existing conditions in the case of CEQA, and the no action alternative in the case of NEPA. CEQA and NEPA use slightly different terminology when assessing impacts, and this terminology is shown on this slide in front of you. There were 9 resource areas, really chapters in the document, that had either no effects, no adverse effects, or less than significant impacts for the entire area, for the entire chapter, really for all of the components analyzed within that chapter. These included fluvial geomorphology, groundwater, minerals, recreation, energy, noise, population and housing, public services, and public health. There were 3 resource areas that had impacts that required mitigation. but the resulting impacts, the impacts after the mitigation was applied, were less than significant or not adverse. These include aquatic biological resources, which is really our fisheries chapter, greenhouse gas emissions, and Indian trust assets. And finally, there were a number of resource areas with at least one impact in the chapter would be significant and unavoidable or adverse and substantial. Keep in mind that it's not that every impact in these chapters were substantial, but at least one was. These are listed on your screen and include surface water quality, vegetation and wetland resources, wildlife resources, geology and soils, land use, agriculture, traffic, air quality, cultural resources, tribal cultural resources, visual, environmental justice and socioeconomics. Many of the individual impacts that were substantial in these chapters are related to construction of the project. I'd now like to highlight a few areas and chapters that we know are of substantial interest. The first is water quality, and there's quite a bit on this side, so let's walk through this. For water quality, we analyzed the quality of inflow or source water, including Sacramento River water and water from the local creeks, Funks and Stone Corral creeks. We also took a look at in-reservoir processes and then analyzed released water quality to different locations downstream of the reservoir. We completed this analysis for metals, pesticides, and temperature, and also looked at things like the potential for harmful algal blooms and invasive aquatic vegetation. Based on this analysis, we found that there would be no substantial increase in salinity and temperature in or downstream of the reservoir. This includes releases to the Sacramento River and no violation of water quality objectives. We also found that the level of nutrients, organic carbon, and dissolved oxygen in releases would not violate water quality standards. Harmful algal blooms have been in the news quite a bit this past year, and we do expect to have these at sites. The mechanism for what drives these is really not well understood at this time. We would address these through monitoring and public notification, similar to how they're addressed at numerous reservoirs throughout our state. The project may also result in the potential for elevated concentrations of some metals and pesticides in the Yolo bypass, really as a result of moving water from the Colusa Basin drain down into the Yolo bypass. We've included a monitoring program and would stop delivering water into the Yolo bypass if elevated concentrations of metals and pesticides are projected to occur. The project may also result in the potential for elevated concentrations of some metals in Stone Corral Creek downstream of the reservoir, really due to the releases, the depth of the releases into this creek. We believe we can address this in the final design process. We also found the potential for substantial increase in methyl mercury concentrations downstream of the reservoir, primarily during the initial filling of the reservoir and for up to 10 years afterwards. We have a number of measures in the document to reduce the potential for methylization of mercury in the reservoir, but conservatively call this impact substantial and adverse. The second area I'd like to highlight is fisheries, and I have focused this slide on diversion criteria and effects to our salmon and steelhead. The fisheries chapter covers a number of species, but I'm only focused here on salmonids, meaning a fish in the salmon family. In consideration of the comments on the 2017 document and discussion with our fisheries resource agencies, the authority made a number of changes to the project diversion criteria since the 2017 document. The revised diversion criteria are reflected in the project description chapter, which is chapter 2, and include criteria for a Wilkins Slough flow bypass, pulse flow protection, and protection of the Fremont Weir Notch project. The project would also only divert water when the Sacramento River is not fully appropriated, which is September 1st to June 15, and when the delta is in excess conditions as determined by reclamation and DWR. And I want to share that we're not saying that there is excess water or water is being wasted to the ocean when we say excess conditions. We understand that the water in our river systems serve important ecological and water supply value for our state. Excess conditions is a term of art, so to speak, that identifies when there is water in the system in excess of the needs of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. And finally, the project would only divert water when there are flows available above those needed to meet applicable laws, regulations, biological opinions, incidental take permits, and court orders in place at the time of diversion. These diversion criteria are quite a bit more protective and restrictive than the criteria used in the 2017 draft EIR/EIS, really to avoid and reduce the effects to the fishery. In the aquatic resource chapter, chapter 11, which is our fisheries chapter, we have identified the potential for significant operational effects to salmonids, including steelhead. Although the diversion criteria are quite a bit more protective, we've included a mitigation measure to further those protections. That measure would require that the project diversions from the Sacramento River in March through May of all water year types would not occur if flows in the river are or would be below 10,700 cubic feet per second as measured at Wilkins Slough. This mitigation measure effectively modifies the project description in chapter 2 and makes the project diversion criteria even more protective of fish. There have been a number of concerns related to the project's potential effects to the Trinity River. The project would not affect the Trinity River system. It would not affect or change the operations of the Central Valley Project Trinity River Division facilities, including those facilities in Clear Creek. Reclamation would continue to operate consistent with all applicable statutory, legal, and contractual obligations, including but not limited to the Trinity River Record of Decision, the 2017 Record of Decision for the long-term plan for the Lower Klamath River, and the provisions of the Trinity River Division Central Valley Project Act of 1955. The project would not result in changes to any of the statutory, legal, and contractual obligations that govern operations of the Trinity River, and thus would not affect the Trinity River system. And the last area I want to highlight for you is our efforts to reach out to tribes. The authority, as the state agency, is responsible for compliance with Assembly Bill 52 requirements, commonly called AB 52. As part of this effort, the authority reached out to 7 tribes in 2020. These 7 tribes are also those that are traditionally or culturally affiliated with lands in the project footprint. We sent hard copy letters to these tribes, emailed them, and followed up with phone calls. 2 tribes responded, and we are in ongoing consultation with these 2 tribes. Although the project's changes and flows in the Sacramento and Feather Rivers are minor, we reached out to 7 additional tribes this year. These 7 tribes are those that are traditionally or culturally affiliated with locations where the project operations have the potential to change flows in rivers. We sent hard copy letters to these tribes, emailed them, and then also followed up with phone calls. To date, none of these tribes have responded. These outreach efforts are detailed in chapter 23 of the revised draft EIR supplemental draft EIS. The authority continues an AB 52 consultation with the 2 tribes, that have responded. Based on previous surveys, we know that there are Native American human remains and other tribal resources in the footprint of the reservoir. The authority is working closely with the tribes that have historically inhabited the reservoir footprint to address impacts to these resources and ensure that Native American human remains are addressed consistent with the tribe's requests. Reclamation as the federal agency is responsible for compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act, typically called Section 106 compliance. This year, Reclamation reached out to 9 tribes. Very recently, 1 tribe has responded, but Reclamation has not received responses from the other 8 tribes. Reclamation plans to reach out to those same tribes again in the coming year. As described in chapter 29 of the revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS, the project does not occur in an area that would affect Indian hunting or water rights, nor is the project on Indian trust lands. We want to hear from you. Your comments are important to us and important to the process. Your comments really help us continue to refine the project and make adjustments to continue to reduce environmental effects. Comments are best when they are focused on the substantive content of the document And comments should be limited to the environmental analysis in the revised draft EIR, supplemental draft EIS. All comments on the document must be postmarked or received by 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on January 11, 2022. The authority and reclamation will respond to all substantive comments received in the comment period in the final EIR EIS. And as a reminder on how to submit those comments, we'll be taking verbal comments after our question and answer session later this morning. You can also submit written comments via email to EIR-EIS-comments@sitesproject.org or via mail to either the authority at P.O. Box 517, Maxwell, California, 95955, or to Reclamation at 2800 Cottage Way, Suite W 2830, Sacramento, California, 95825. And a reminder that all comments must be mailed or postmarked by January 11, 2022. This concludes our presentation portion of the meeting, and I'd like to hand this back to Sarah to lead us through the question and answer session.